How's it going, class? This week we'll be starting a new section on existentialist ethics, which focuses on radical freedom and the burden of choice. Most other ethical systems, you'll have noticed, typically start with principles or rules or something of that kind to govern rational or ethical behavior rationally. This kind of system, this meta-ethical approach, is going to take as its starting point the fact that you're a free agent. So the idea that you're a free agent, you're an actor in the world, and you have free choice. Your subjectivity is going to be the starting point, or the subjectivity of persons is going to be the starting point. The fact that we're free agents is what the focus is. So let's get into it. In this lecture, we'll be going over context and origins, which are pretty important for this. It's a post-war emergence of an atheistic ethic, which takes, as I said before, subjectivity as its starting point, the fact that you can act in the world. Subjectivity is the opposite of objectivity. It's going to be the fact that you're a person, you're a subject, not an object, and we'll get into that. The second part, we'll talk about existence preceding essence. It sounds a little complicated, but basically the idea is that human beings create themselves apart from any design plan on this view, on this meta-ethical approach, and we'll get into that. The third section, we'll talk about the student's dilemma, which is a real-life dilemma that Jean-Paul Sartre was faced with, or brought one of his students brought to him, and how he responds based on his ethical commitments. And we'll talk about that. It's pretty interesting. In section 4, we'll talk about radical freedom and responsibility, more particularly why external guides fail, why rules and principles in other places are never going to work. The concepts of anguish and abandonment, which we'll get into. These are technical terms for Sartre, and I'll explain those, and how we create ourselves by way of our choices and what that means for ethics. And finally, in the last section, we'll talk about bad faith and authenticity, or inauthentic actions. Bad faith versus authenticity. So bad faith actions are going to be inauthentic. The ethics of subjects who are burdened with freedom is the basic idea. And the difference between a bad faith and a good faith action, and an authentic and an inauthentic action. And we'll get into that. It's important to understand the context and origins of this view. It was developed largely after the First and Second World War. It was developed largely by French existentialists, people who were affected by these conflicts and the violence and the war more generally. And that has a huge effect on the way that they're reasoning about the world, about their ethical considerations and commitments. And it makes for a very unique theory. So we'll get into that. So one thing that's really important to note about existentialism, or an existentialist approach to ethics, is that the progenitors of this theory, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and maybe Albert Camus, they're usually French existentialists, and they took atheism as a starting point for their ethical reasoning. So there's no God, there's no divine plan, there's no creator. That is a tenet that they start from. Okay, I wanted to note, and I noted below in this slide, that not all existentialists are atheists. In fact, the school of thought was founded by Soren Kierkegaard, who was a deeply committed Christian, who took subjectivity as the starting point for a lot of his reasoning. But in this particular branch of ethics, existentialist ethics is typically starting from the idea that there's no God, and theism is false. That's one thing that they're starting with. They don't really argue for it, but because this was brought on, or this reasoning was brought on after the horrors of World Wars I and II, it prompted a lot of reflection on human meaning and value, and they decided to start from that point, and that's what we're going to have to take for granted when we learn about this theory. So without a divine blueprint to rely on, all philosophical inquiry is going to begin solely from the reality of the human condition. And we'll get into exactly what they mean by that, but this is the sort of starting point that Sartre takes for granted. So one famous quote from Existentialism as a Humanism, which was assigned to you as part of your reading, is the following. The conception of man in the mind of God is comparable to a letter opener in the mind of an artisan, meaning that the artisan creates a piece of art according to a plan. He has a thought in his head, something about maybe a task in mind that he wants to accomplish or achieve, or maybe something beautiful he wants to create, and then he creates the thing in accordance with the thought, with the idea that he has. Sartre is going to argue that that's not the case for human beings. Human beings create themselves, but he argues this for pretty unique reasons, and we'll get into that more specifically now. So one famous tagline that will help you sort of understand existentialist ethics, or something that is kind of a slogan, or maybe the headline of existentialist ethics for a lot of different thinkers, especially Jean-Paul Sartre, is existence comes before essence, or sometimes existence precedes essence. What that means is objects have their essence first. They have their essence prior to their existence, whereas subjects exist first and then create their essence by way of choices. And so Sartre's example is a letter opener, like I just mentioned a second ago. It's designed with a specific purpose in mind before it's manufactured. It has a design plan, an intended function. Its essence is conceptually prior to its physical reality. So objects are definable before they exist. On the other hand, subjects, human subjects in particular, are not preconceived or designed. There's no biological or fixed human nature blueprint that exists before we do. Subjects are born into existence first, and then we define ourselves throughout our entire life, our ongoing choices and actions and other things like that. So subjects, unlike objects, exist before they have an essence. It's a very important point for existentialist ethics because it puts the shoe on the other foot. As I mentioned, existentialist ethics starts with the fact that we're subjects that choose. And doing that puts a very different complexion on ethics. Another famous quote which helps couch this point is that man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Such is the first principle of existentialism. So there's no human nature, there's no design plan, and we just are the sum of our choices, is the essential takeaway for Sartre. And he thinks that this is a very good way of thinking about what we are as ethical actors and why we should start that way when we're thinking about ethics. There's also a quote that was misattributed to Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson is supposed to have said this, but I can't find the source of it, and I've actually kind of come to the conclusion he probably didn't say it. But this is a helpful way to maybe couch the same kind of point. The quote goes like this: "You sow a thought and you reap an action. You sow an act and you reap a habit. You sow a habit and you reap a character, and you sow a character to reap a destiny." Okay, that's the sort of idea that's funding what's going on behind this existentialist ethic, which is the idea that it's like man is nothing else but what he creates himself. That's one of the first principles here, and it's a very important thing to remember about existentialist ethics. So now that we have a sketch of what's going on with existentialist ethics more generally, it's still pretty vague. So I'll give an illustrative case of a student that goes to Jean-Paul Sartre after one of his lectures and poses a philosophical dilemma and basically asks his advice. And Sartre's answer is illustrative of the sort of ethics that he's recommending or proposing through his commitments in existentialism. So the dilemma goes like this. The student's brother and his father were killed by the Germans in 1940. The young man was torn between traveling to England to join the Free French forces to avenge his brother and liberate France, or stay in Paris and care for his widowed and hobbled with grief mother, who depended on him entirely for comfort and even survival. And so he's asking Jean-Paul Sartre. He goes to this great philosopher, this great thinker who's quite famous for his ethical theories, and he says, "I have this ethical dilemma. Do I fight for France, or do I take care of my ailing mother?" And the advice that Sartre gives is pretty striking. So the student seeks his advice, and Sartre refuses to make the decision for him. He says something like, he's explaining there's no universal moral rules. If you're not a Christian and you're not a Kantian and you don't have these sort of wider rules to appeal to, you can't solve that conflict by appealing to rules or even getting advice from himself even. And so he tells the student, you are free, therefore choose. That is to say, invent. It's your choice what you do. Going to somebody for advice, including Sartre himself, is not the way to resolve this ethical dilemma. Basically, Sartre says, I can't make this choice for you, and anything I tell you is just going to tilt your decision in a way that you might expect it to tilt your decision. You went to a philosopher who's an openly atheistic thinker. If you would have gone to a priest, if you would have gone to a different person, they're going to tilt your advice towards what they would do in that situation. But ultimately, you can't resolve this by way of choices, or you can't resolve this by way of rules. You just have to choose, that is to say, invent. Do what you're going to do and make the choice on your own and accept your decision, basically. So upon hearing this answer that Sartre gives to the student, you might think to yourself, well, that's kind of a cold and callous answer. Like, why not give the student advice? I mean, obviously he's coming to him because he thinks that he might give some insight or lend some advice, from his experience to that kid's moral decision. And, maybe that could take some weight off of him. It might help him a little bit. So why not give him a better answer than that? Why not say something different? Well, ultimately, it flows from Sartre's commitments as an existentialist ethicist. Ultimately, he thinks that the buck stops at choice. Morality morality and ethical reasoning is ultimately a function of the choices that we make. And so this is a logical response given Sartre's commitments. Sartre thinks that ethics bottoms out in choice. And so for him to give advice to the student is to sort of take away some of the student's ability to make that choice. Ultimately, it's the student's choice. And so to give him advice might slant him one direction or the other. That's not a good faith way to make choices, and therefore it's unethical. We'll talk more about good faith and bad faith in a moment, but I want to just flag that it's like, this seems like a pretty callous answer, but if you think about Sartre's commitments, it's the logical thing to recommend. So the upshot here is that what makes things right and wrong, good and bad, ultimately are just the choices that we make. That's what Sartre wants to argue, that guidelines like moral theories or internally contrived feelings or seeking advice, these things are not the bottom floor of ethics. Ultimately, it bottoms out in choice. So moral theories can't definitively guide us because they require a personal interpretation, applying broad maxims like Kant's categorical imperative, the Sermon on the Mount, or the Ten Commandments to specific conflicting duties always demands a subjective choice at the end of the day. So you might think the student is facing two conflicting sets of duties. On the one hand, he seems to have a duty to his mother to take care of her because of, she's obviously hobbled with grief. She's just lost two of the most important people in the world to her. How's she going to live? How will she subsist? And then on the other hand, you might think to yourself, well, he has a duty to his country. He has a duty to his deceased family members to avenge or to fight for France and fight against the tyranny where so many other mothers are hobbled with grief because of the actions of the Nazis. That might be another set of duties that comes into conflict. But what Sartre wants to say is it's like you're presented with a moral dilemma when you meet a choice between two sets of conflicting duties, which both seem to impose on you. And so Sartre wants to say, well, you have duties that are obviously clear from the moral theories that we have, but that's not what makes a thing moral. What makes a thing moral, what makes an action an ethical action, is the choice at the that's ultimately where things bottom out. That's what, at the end of the day, makes something moral, is the subjective choices that we make. On the other hand, you might think to yourself, well, feelings. I have an internal feeling. I have that sort of a gut feeling that guides me towards which choice I can make. But ultimately, those can only act as guidelines because their true value really comes from actions in the past, or that we retroactively give emotions certain kinds of meaning and value by interpretation. But really, it just bottoms out in what we ultimately decide to do. That's the ethical bottom line. That's what it means to be a moral actor, is that it's what we do that ultimately defines what the internal feelings end up telling us in the future and how we interpret them. That's why choice is ultimately where this bottoms out. So internal feelings are not a real good candidate for the meat or the bottom floor of what counts as a moral ethical action. And seeking advice, as the student tried to do, is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Sartre actually argues that it's like we choose our advisors based on what we secretly know that they're going to recommend. The student goes to Sartre, and the student knows that Sartre is an atheist philosopher, and he's going to have a certain bent because of his character, because of what he already knows about him. But if the student had gone to a priest that was a known pacifist, or maybe he goes to a chaplain who is a known advocate of fighting in this war, he's going to get the advice that comes from that person. And so it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy to say, well, ultimately I'm seeking advice because I want to make my choice better. And it's like, well, really, ultimately, it's all going to bottom out in your choice. And so it doesn't matter what advice you're going to take. In fact, going to people who give you advice on one way or the other is making a choice in bad faith. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. It's about making choices authentically and ultimately accepting your responsibility as an ethical agent is what it means to be authentic. But I'll talk about that in one moment. So a technical term that's really important in Sartre and in Sartre's view and in existentialist ethics more generally is abandonment. The concept of abandonment, Sartre says, is that once we accept that there's no God and therefore no design plan, no blueprint, something that they felt was necessary to accept, that we feel this sense of abandonment, that we're on our own, that we're out to sea, that we're just sort of, we're stuck making our own choices. And without God, there's no obvious values or moral laws. So we're entirely alone. Our actions are just up to us. But once we realize that our actions are completely up to us, there's no universal values to justify our decisions or excuse our actions. Clinging to moral theories as if they possess inherent unquestionable authority involves pretending that there's a God. And so if we've already accepted that there is no God, that we're sort of on our own, the feeling of abandonment is a consequence. So another headline for the existentialists is that man is doomed to be free. It's very punchy. Some of you might know this, but Sartre is a very accomplished playwright. He wrote a play called No Exit, where he said hell is other people, and he's got a lot of punchy quotes. But man is doomed to be free is one that you should remember, because that's ultimately what the existentialists are trying to say, that freedom is something that is endowed upon us, that we have responsibility for our choices, and there's no way out of this. And any way we try to scurry out from under our responsibility is going to be unethical. So Sartre's mandate to the student is that you're free. So choose, in other words, invent, is not so much like this, well, you can do whatever you want. It's not a hand waving. He's saying you are stuck with the freedom that you have. I can't make the choice for you. Your choice is what invents the moral fabric of the ethical decision that you make. The choice that you make is moral because you made it, might be one way to put it. So there's no external guides or pre-existing rules that we can strictly follow to make certain that we've made a moral choice. Moral choice is analogous to constructing a work of art. The creative act itself establishes the rules. So like this MC Escher picture that you'll see on the slide where the hands are drawing themselves, MC Escher is a very good artist, but he draws these very paradoxical pictures. That's the sort of reasoning that Sartre is ultimately concluding with. He says that we invent our morality through our choices. So we endow our actions with value in an otherwise valueless world. The world doesn't have value inherently in it. It's not imbued with morality from above, from a god or anything like that, according to this school of thought. The fact is that we are imbuing value into a valueless world. And this is painted as a very sort of courageous philosophy, where the existentialists, if you read Existentialism is Humanism, you'll see it. The existentialist philosophers are sort of saying, it's like, well, look, we're facing reality as we find it. This is the situation we find ourselves in. We feel abandoned because we are saddled with this burden of freedom, and there's nothing we can do about that. So making our choices clear-eyed and not trying to sidestep or scurry out from under the burden of this freedom, we intrepid explorers in the realm of morality, we are the ones who imbue reality with value by way of our choices. That's the ultimate bottom line of ethics. And trying to shift responsibility to, the Ten Commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, Kant's categorical imperative, all of that is just trying to scurry out of the responsibility that we obviously have. That's the line of thought that we're trying to, that Sartre is trying to push here. And ultimately it ends with saying that man is doomed to be free. So this brings in the concept of anguish. Anguish is what we feel when we realize how we are doomed to be free. There's a profoundly disturbing sense of the weight of our own freedom, because lives and the moral image of humanity are at stake when we make choices. Significant choices inevitably provoke this sort of anguish. That's the word that Sartre uses. Anguish is definitely a good description of how you'd feel if you learned that there was no God, no plan, and no morality other than your own choice. But anguish for Sartre is a technical term. It's reckoning with the fact that you are doomed to be free. That's the closest way I could put it. So don't get confused. Anguish and abandonment are technical terms. And in Sartre's technical language, anguish is what you feel when you feel the weight of the crushing weight of the responsibility of your own choices. So for yourself, you make choices for yourself because we're self-making beings. Everything that we do is our own doing. Our choices can't be justified or excused by pre-existing values or even circumstances. We bear absolute responsibility. But further than that, we also choose to exemplify what we think is valuable. Imposing value onto the world by way of our choices, we example our values for other people. And so we have a universal responsibility. We choose a way of life. We implicitly affirm it as valuable. Okay, so in choosing for yourself, you recommend that value implicitly to everyone who's watching you. And so we create a picture for other people to follow. Okay, and it's not as if you're appealing to other people by way of advice. That would be a bad faith choice. And we'll get into this sort of authentic, inauthentic, good faith, bad faith in a minute. But basically, the idea is that when you choose, you example your values for others. And so you implicitly recommend those values to others by way of your choices. So you're not only responsible for yourself, as in making yourself, like Sartre says, but you're also responsible for the people who watch you, who see you, because you give them a picture and therefore a recommendation. So this brings to the foreground the difference between good faith choices and bad faith choices. A good faith choice is one that's authentic, and a bad faith choice is one that's inauthentic. Okay, it can be a little confusing, but that's basically what it is. I've referred to it a couple of times. We'll talk about it a little more specifically now. So a bad faith choice is a form of self-deception where the individual attempts to escape the anguish of choice by denying their radical freedom and responsibility in some way or other. This often manifests as blaming circumstances, claiming, I had no other choice, or treating oneself as an object with a fixed, unchangeable essence, which Sartre says you are not. You're a subject. You make yourself. Your existence is first, and then your essence comes. You build your essence by way of your choices. So Sartre is saying that it's like you make bad faith choices when you try to sidestep that responsibility that is inherent on you as a human chooser, as a subject. That's something that you're just saddled with. There's nothing you can do about that. So to make choices that try to skirt responsibility or shift the blame, that is a bad faith choice. On the other hand, a good faith or authentic choice is one that acts with full, unblinking awareness of one's freedom and absolute responsibility, completely avoiding any of this self-deception from the bad faith case. It involves acknowledging that we are self-making beings and takes ownership of our actions without excuses or some imagined destiny which, guides us. We're not on guardrails. We make choices and we're literally free to choose, that is to invent. That's the idea. So a bad faith choice is a form of self-deception. A good faith choice is an authentic choice, which takes radical freedom and the absolute responsibility that we are saddled with very, very seriously. It doesn't try to sidestep it or shift the blame. Okay, so summing up, I just want to go over 3 key points that I want you to remember for this regarding this school of thought. So first, man is condemned to be free. Second, man is universally responsible because our examples give the examples of what we value to other people. And so when they make their choices, they will inherently consider our examples. And 3, that there are good faith and bad faith choices. And acting in bad faith is a way of deceiving yourself and caving to the anguish that we feel under the weight of our own freedom. So man is condemned to be free. Man is responsible for all men in the examples that we give, and in endowing otherwise a valueless choice set with value. And acting in bad or good faith is up to us. And trying to escape anguish and shifting responsibility is not the way that we should approach that. That's an inherently wrong thing to do. So that we should act in good faith, and that's just fully embracing what we are as ethical agents. So in closing, I just wanted to pose a discussion question, which it might be interesting to you guys. So here it is. If there are no universal values to guide moral choice, what makes a choice meaningful rather than merely random? And randomness and meaning, you might think there's a tension in between those things. Things that are random are not meaningful, and things that are meaningful are not random. So for instance, if you were walking down the beach and you saw a collection of seashells, which were in an interesting shape that had sort of washed up onto the shore and made this interesting sort of shape, you might think to yourself that that's interesting, but I don't think many people would find that meaningful, maybe in the sense of significant. Meaning and significance are often conflated. So the meaning of a text is something that the author intended to say versus the significance is how it struck you. That's a good distinction to hold in your mind, and I like to hold that. I learned that when I was a graduate student. I thought, that's a really good distinction. So I'd walk up and maybe I'd find the situation of the seashells being in some sort of interesting pattern. I might find that meaningful in the sense of significance, but I don't think that would lead me to believe that there was any sort of agency behind it, or that it had any meaning in it in the sense that it was intended. Okay, but on the other hand, I kept walking down the same beach, and then I found a collection of seashells which spelled out my social security number. then I would think someone did this. This is not random, because the meaning in it, or the meaningfulness of it, or the fact that it's imbued with meaning, that is something that counts against it being just purely random. Now, taking this back to Sartre's ethical reasonings, is it the case that if we just have values and there's no guides, we make value by making choices, there's no real rules that outline particularly moral choice, then what makes a choice meaningful rather than random? How do we imbue an otherwise valueless world, which is something Sartre and the existentialists think? How do we imbue an otherwise valueless world with value if choice just seems perfectly random? If meaning and randomness are at odds, it seems like value and randomness would actually be at odds as well. Now, you might not think that that works. Maybe that's equivocal. Maybe maybe there is some tension there. Maybe not. But if you feel that tension, I would encourage you to think about that more closely. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about some objections to this theory, Sartre's theory, and some reasons why you might think that the reasoning there fails. That ethics doesn't really bottom out in only radical choice. We don't just throw ourselves into the choices that we make. We don't just completely make choices randomly. Maybe there's something a little bit more, maybe there's something unreasonable about that. We're going to discuss that a little bit more closely. And we look forward to talking to you next time.